In the smog-choked spires of High-Avernus, power isn't held. It is strangled. Hale Strix sat at the center of this industrial nightmare. A man whose reputation was a jagged blade, and whose silence was a death sentence for anyone who dared to breathe too loudly. He was the Vulture of the Heights, ruling the iron trade and the black market energy grids with a cold, calculated precision that left no room for blood or heat. For 20 years Denver had been a ghost in a tailored suit, a shadow presiding over a kingdom of soot. But today the soot is being washed away by a revelation he never saw coming. In his hand he holds a rusted mechanical compass, a relic from the life he abandoned before he learned that the only way to lead was to stay out of the light. He was the most feared man in the Heights, but he was about to learn that the most powerful thing you can do with a kingdom is let it go. The lightning in High-Avernus didn't just strike. It pulsed, illuminating the chemical clouds that swirled around Denver's obsidian balcony. Hale Strix stood as still as the gargoyles decorating his fortress, his eyes fixed on the flickering red warning lights of the lower-level refineries. He was 45, but he looked like he was made of the same unyielding iron he sold. He didn't rule through chaos, he ruled through the Strix Mandate, a system of absolute, clinical order where every variable was accounted for, and every human emotion was treated as a flaw in the machinery. Behind him, moving with the silent lethargy of a predator, was Avonlea Fira. Avonlea was Denver's shadow, the stoker of his fires, a man who had walked through the ash of their childhood streets beside him for 3 decades. Avonlea was the physical manifestation of Denver's will. The energy core at the North Spire was compromised, Avonlea said, his voice a low, raspy hum. 2 sentries are down. The vault wasn't robbed, it was sabotaged. Denver didn't flinch. He simply watched the way the lightning reflected in his own cold, dark eyes. The saboteur? Denver asked. The words were clipped, carrying the weight of a guillotine blade. In High-Avernus there was no court, only the Vulture's decision. He had spent his life convinced that vulnerability was a virus, and that the only way to protect his legacy was to stay isolated in his tower of glass and steel. He had mastered the heights, but he had forgotten the feeling of the ground. It was the strategist, Denver. Tavric Sol Venn, Avonlea replied. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tavric was the mind behind the mandate, the one who calculated the trade routes and managed the encrypted ledgers. He was the only person Denver had ever allowed into the inner sanctum of his thoughts. To the syndicate, Tavric was the brain. To Denver, he was the closest thing he had to a son, a legacy he had groomed to inherit the Iron Crown. Bring him to the precipice, Denver said. He felt a sharp, hollow ache in his chest, a vibration that had nothing to do with the heavy machinery of the city. He knew the mandate's law. Betrayal is a debt that can only be settled in the abyss. Avonlea nodded, the light of the pulsing sky catching the cold metal of the injectors at his belt. As Denver watched his oldest friend depart, he looked at the mechanical compass on his desk. He realized that the greatest threat to his empire wasn't a rival syndicate. It was the fact that he still possessed a heart that could be broken. The heavy, lead-lined doors of the observation deck groaned open, and Tavric Sol Venn was shoved into the light. He fell to the cold metal floor, his hands zip-tied, his breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. His face was smudged with soot, but his eyes, amber and burning, stayed fixed on Denver. Tavric didn't look like a traitor. He looked like a man who had finally seen a way out of a burning building. Denver didn't turn around. He let the wind from the open heights howl through the room, a cold, mournful sound that usually signaled an execution. I gave you the keys to the heights, Tavric, Denver said finally, his voice like grinding stones. I taught you that the only truth in this world is control. Why did you reach for the core? He turned then, his face a mask of frozen authority, looking down at the man he had once planned to call heir. I didn't reach for the core to steal it, Denver, Tavric whispered, his voice struggling against the wind. I reached for it to vent it. The mandate is an order. It's a slow suffocation. You're draining the lower levels to keep the lights on up here. I saw the children in the Sump breathing the exhaust of your refineries. I couldn't be the architect of their graveyard anymore. I couldn't be the man you wanted me to be. Denver felt a flicker of something long dormant, a memory of the ground, but he crushed it under the weight of his office. The Sump is a necessary sacrifice for the survival of the Heights, Tavric. You sold the override codes to the Rustwalkers. You gave away our shield. He walked toward him, his boots clicking rhythmically on the metal deck. He stopped at the edge of the precipice, where the clouds broke to reveal a 2,000-foot drop into the smog. Avonlea stepped forward, his hand resting on the heavy piston gauntlet he wore for settling disputes. He was waiting for the word. He was the enforcement of the Vulture's law. The Spire Lords are watching, Denver, Avonlea said. If Tavric lives, the Mandate dies. If the Mandate dies, the city falls to the Walkers by midnight. We have to end the infection. Denver looked at Tavric's throat, at the pulse jumping beneath the skin. He could end the threat with a single gesture. But his eyes drifted back to the compass. He remembered the day he found Tavric in the Sump, a boy with a broken leg and a brilliant mind. He had chosen to lift him up then. Why was it so much harder to let him go now? Standing by the door, framed by the red emergency strobes, was Brenlo Ashvare. He was a young courier barely 20, who handled the physical data drives. He was Tavric's younger brother. Denver had taken them both in, believing that shared blood would ensure shared loyalty. Brenlo stood there now, his face a mask of gray terror, witnessing the imminent fall of the only person who had ever protected him. It was Brenlo who had been caught carrying the data drive that Tavric had sabotaged. He was the one who had, out of fear, led Avonlea to the Spire. Brenlo, Denver said, his voice cutting through the young man's panic. Step forward. The boy moved like a ghost, his legs nearly giving out. He stood over his brother, looking down at him with a gaze of pure, unadulterated shame. He knew his silence had been bought with his brother's life. He had followed the code Denver had taught him. The Heights come first. You did what was required, Brenlo, Denver said, his eyes scanning the boy's trembling frame. You served the Mandate. You ensured the Spire remained lit. Now, as the one who brought the evidence, tell me the punishment for a man who seeks to extinguish our light. It was a trial by fire. Denver wanted to see if the cold iron of Avernus had completely replaced the boy's heart. He wanted to see if the cycle of abandonment could be broken. Brenlo looked at Tavric, then at Avonlea's heavy gauntlet, then finally at the Vulture. A single soot-streaked tear fell. He's all I have, Brenlo whispered, his voice breaking. I'm the one who failed. I didn't stop him. If he has to go over the edge, take me too. I don't want to live in the light if he's in the abyss. Tavric closed his eyes, a broken sound escaping his lips. No, Brenlo. Stay. The room was filled with the scent of ozone and raw human agony. Avonlea tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes cold and uncomprehending. In his world you purged the weak so the strong could breathe. He looked at Denver, waiting for the command of the Vulture. But Denver was looking at the boy's willingness to fall into the abyss for a traitor. It was a mirror of a choice Denver had never been brave enough to make. He felt the iron in his chest begin to crack. He reached out and placed a hand on Brenlo's head. It wasn't a strike. It was a blessing. Go to the lower bays, Denver said. Wait by the transport. You're becoming soft, Denver, Avonlea said once the boy had fled. His voice wasn't a challenge, but it carried the grim reality of a man who knew how power was maintained. The Rustwalkers are at the gate. The Spire Lords are already voting on your replacement. If Tavric doesn't die, you lose your throne. Mercy in High-Avernus is just a slow suicide. Denver walked back to his obsidian desk and sat. The chair felt like a cage. He looked at Tavric, who remained on the floor, waiting for the abyss. Do you believe in the Heights, Tavric? He asked. He needed to understand the conviction that would make a man choose the smog over the Spire. I believe in the people who live beneath them, Denver, Tavric replied, his amber eyes clear. I believe that true authority isn't about how high you sit, but how much of your own breath you're willing to give to those who are choking. You think you're a god because you're untouched by the soot, but you're just a statue. You've traded your soul for a view of a city that fears you. Denver looked at his own hands. They were clean, untouched by manual labor, yet he felt the grime of 1,000 compromises. He realized Tavric was right. His power was a wall that kept him safe, but it also kept him from ever feeling the warmth of a real sun. He was the master of a dying empire. He looked at Avonlea, his oldest friend, the man who had done the dirty work so Denver's hands could stay white. Avonlea was the ghost of his own past, the violence he had never outgrown. Avonlea, Denver said, his voice resonating in the cold room. If I told you to step off that ledge right now for me, would you? Avonlea didn't hesitate. I have given you my life for 30 years, Denver. The abyss wouldn't be any different. And if I asked you to forgive the boy who tried to save his brother? Denver asked. The word forgive sounded like heresy in the spire. Avonlea spat on the floor. Forgiveness doesn't refine iron, Denver. It makes it brittle. It's a luxury for those who don't have enemies at the gates. Maybe, Denver whispered. He looked at Tavric. He saw the fire of a man who had found a purpose beyond survival. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't a brittleness. It was a tempering. It was the only thing that could actually change the machinery. To kill Tavric was expected. To forgive him, that would be the first unpredictable thing the Vulture had ever done. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small encrypted key. Not to a cell, but to the private shuttle bay. He felt the cold metal in his hand, a weight of immense possibility. Denver stood and walked to Tavric. He pulled a serrated utility blade from his pocket, the edge shimmering under the red strobes. Tavric flinched, leaning back toward the edge of the precipice, expecting the final cut. Avonlea tensed, his gauntlet humming with kinetic energy, ready to deliver the killing blow if the Vulture hesitated. The tension was a living shadow in the room. But the blade didn't find Tavric's throat. It found the zip ties on his wrists. With two sharp movements the plastic snapped. Tavric's hands fell, the blood rushing back into his fingers with a painful prickle. He looked up at Denver, his expression transitioning from terror to a deep, unsettling confusion. Why? He asked. Because the heights are cold, Tavric, Denver said, his voice carrying a sudden, ancient weariness. He reached down and gripped Tavric's hand, pulling him up from the cold floor. It was the first time in years Denver had touched a man without intending to hurt him. He was the Vulture and he was finally letting go of the kill. Avonlea let out a low, dangerous snarl. Denver, don't. You're giving the city to the Rustwalkers. If you let him walk, you're inviting the fire. The Lords will have our heads before the sun rises. He blocked the exit, his gauntlet glowing a warning orange. He was protecting Denver in the only way he knew how, through the maintenance of the dark. The Rustwalkers are coming because they want what we have, Denver said, turning to face his oldest friend. They want the iron. They want the power. But they don't know that the power is a poison. For 20 years we've held the heights and look at us. We're two old men in a tower of ash, waiting for a storm to blow us over. He tossed the encrypted key on the floor. It rang against the metal, a bright, clear sound in the howl of the wind. Take Brenlow and the shuttle, Tavric. Go to the Western Isles. The mandate doesn't reach that far. Don't look back at this spire. It's a tomb. Tavric looked at the key, then at Denver. He saw the sacrifice. Denver wasn't just granting mercy. He was choosing to be the one who stayed behind to face the Lords and the Walkers. He was becoming the shield for the strategist he had once called son. Tavric picked up the key, his fingers trembling. He looked at the door, where Avonlea stood like an iron wall of resentment. Then he looked back at Denver. They'll tear you apart for this, he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a certainty. He knew the Spire Lords. They valued the iron more than the man who sold it. Denver was currently dismantling their world. Let them, Denver said, and a strange, terrifying calm settled over him. He walked back to his obsidian desk and sat down, folding his hands. He looked like a king waiting for his executioners. I've spent a lifetime building a fortress of ash. If the only way to clear the air is to let the tower fall, then let it fall. But you and Brenlow, you're going to see a sky that isn't red. Tavric hesitated, then turned and ran toward the lower bay. Denver heard his footsteps echoing on the metal gratings, heard him calling for Brenlow, heard the distant, high-pitched whine of the shuttle's engines engaging. Then there was only the wind and Avonlea. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was a release. Avonlea didn't move from the door. He looked at Denver, his eyes filled with a grief he had no words for. I can't let you do this, Denver. I've killed for you. I've stood in the soot for you. I won't watch you throw away 30 years of blood for a boy who doesn't understand the heights. He raised his gauntlet, the orange glow reflecting in his tears. If the mandate must stand, it must stand on your blood. Denver didn't flinch. He looked at the glowing weapon, then at his oldest friend. Then do it evenly. If you think this iron is more important than my soul, then end it. But ask yourself, if you kill me to save the mandate, what exactly are you saving? A pile of rust? A city of ghosts? We died a long time ago, evenly. This is the first time I've felt my own pulse in decades. Evenly's hand shook. The gauntlet hummed and sputtered. He had been Denver's shadow for so long. He didn't know how to exist in a world where the vulture wasn't a predator. He was caught in the trap of his own devotion. Evenly let out a ragged, agonizing breath, the gauntlet hovering between duty and love. The spire groaned as a massive explosion rocked the lower levels. The Rustwalkers had breached the main gates. The sounds of heavy machinery grinding and the screams of the refineries failing began to rise, a chaotic symphony that signaled the end of High-Avernus. The empire Denver had built was being dismantled by the very rage he had once used to fuel it. Evenly didn't strike. He lowered his gauntlet, the glow fading into a dull cold gray. The fire had left him, replaced by a hollow crushing silence. He couldn't kill Denver and he couldn't save the spire. The gates are down, Evenly said, his voice flat. The lords have fled to the escape pods. The refineries are venting. There is no one left to lead. Good, Denver said, standing up. He walked to the center of the observation deck, standing under the flickering red emergency lights. He looked at the massive obsidian doors, hearing the frantic pounding of the workers and the screams of the dying machinery. The mandate is over, Evenly. I've sent the shutdown command to the energy grid. I'm tired of the trade. It's a debt that can never be paid with more iron. Evenly looked at him in total shock. You killed the spire? You gave the heights to the Sump. I gave the city back to the people, Evenly. Without the iron trade, it's just a place where they can breathe again. The vulture is done. Denver walked over to Evenly and placed a hand on his shoulder. Go to the auxiliary tunnels, Evenly. They lead to the outer docks. You can still make it. You've been a loyal stoker. But it's time for you to find a hearth of your own. Evenly shook his head, a single tear cutting through the soot on his cheek. I don't have anywhere else to go, Denver. I am the shadow. If the spire falls, I vanish. But Denver didn't answer. He turned to face the obsidian doors just as they began to buckle under the heat of the Rustwalkers' torches. He stood with his arms open, a man who had traded his iron throne for the hope of a boy he called son. He was ready to pay the price for the mercy he had shown. He was the shield for the transition, the end of the old world. The doors melted inward, a cascade of molten iron and black smoke. The Rustwalkers swarmed in, their faces hidden by crude masks, their weapons fashioned from the very scrap Denver had sold them. They were the vengeful ghosts of the Sump, led by a man named Jax, a man who had lost his family to the refineries 10 years ago. Jax stepped through the haze, his eyes burning with a triumphant, murderous fire. He held a jagged energy saw, his gaze searching for the legendary Vulture. He found Denver standing in the center of the deck, unarmed, unmoving, and strangely radiant in the red light. Jax stopped, his men fanning out, their crude sights fixed on Denver's chest. Where are the codes, Strix? Jax demanded, his voice echoing in the ruined room. Where is the override for the North Spire? Give it to me and I'll make it quick. Don't make me pull this tower down with you inside. He stepped closer, the teeth of the energy saw inches from Denver's heart. He was looking for the arrogance of a lord. He was looking for the fear of a victim. Denver didn't look at the saw. He looked at Jax. He saw a man who was exactly who Denver used to be, cold, angry, and convinced that destruction was the only way to be heard. The codes are gone, Jax. And the spire is cold. There is nothing left for you here but the air. Denver's voice was steady, a deep resonance that seemed to calm the chaos of the room. Jax growled, a low, animal sound of frustration. He pressed the saw harder against Denver's suit. You think you're a savior now? You think because you let one boy go, the slate is clean? You're a murderer, Denver. You're the reason my mother is in the earth. You're the reason the Sump is a graveyard. There is no mercy for men like us. There is only the furnace. I know, Denver whispered. He closed his eyes, feeling the heat of the saw. He thought of Tavric and Brenlow somewhere in the west seeing a blue sky. He thought of the compass. He realized that Jax was right, there was a furnace. But it wasn't a punishment. It was a refining. By standing here, by taking the hate of the city upon himself, he was finally breaking the chain of the heights. He felt a radiant, sacrificial love in his chest that was more powerful than the energy saw. He was ready to be the bridge. Jax's finger tightened on the saw's trigger. The room was silent, the rustwalkers holding their breath, waiting for the final fall of the vulture. The air was thick with the scent of burning oil and ozone. Denver stood perfectly still, a man of iron and grace, his eyes open now, looking past Jax at the horizon where the smog was finally beginning to lift. But the saw never bit. A sudden jarring crash echoed from the auxiliary tunnel. Avonlea had returned, not through the escape dock, but through the maintenance vents. He didn't have a weapon. He had a simple heavy iron crowbar. He swung it with a desperate final strength, catching the saw and knocking it from Jax's hands. The saw hummed across the floor, cutting a jagged line into the obsidian desk. The room erupted into violence. The rustwalkers, startled by the shadow's return, hesitated for a split second. It was all the time Avonlea needed. He tackled Jax, the two of them crashing into the precipice. Get to the shuttle, Denver. Avonlea screamed, his voice a raw, agonizing plea. Go. Denver didn't go. He moved toward them, his hands open. He saw the rustwalkers leveling their scrap guns at Avonlea. He saw the end of his oldest friend. Stop! Denver roared, a voice that carried an authority no longer based on the mandate, but on a desperate, sacrificial love. He stepped between the guns and the two men on the floor, his body a shield of charcoal gray silk and human flesh. The rustwalkers froze, confused by the Lord who was putting himself in the line of fire to save the man who had always done his killing. Jax pushed Avonlea away and scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at Denver, then at the broken shadow on the floor, then at his own people. He saw the way his men were looking at Denver. They weren't looking at a Spire Lord. They were looking at something they had never seen in High-Avernus, a man who was willing to die for a ghost. The power in the room had shifted completely. Jax realized that if he killed Denver now, he would only prove Denver's point. He would be the Lord and Denver would be the truth. He lowered his hand, his chest heaving with the weight of the moment. Get out, Jax whispered, the words sounding like ash. Take your shadow and vanish. The heights belong to the Sump now. If I ever see your face in this sky again, I'll burn the horizon to find you. Denver didn't say a word. He reached down and helped Avonlea to his feet. Avonlea was battered, his face bleeding, but he was alive. They walked toward the private elevator, through the ranks of the rustwalkers, a king and his shadow stepping out of the Tower of Ash. As the doors closed, Denver looked at the city one last time. The lightning had stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the chemical clouds. He had lost his spire, yet as he felt Avonlea's weight against his shoulder, he realized he had finally found his heart. The vulture was gone. There was only a man walking into the light. Denver Hale Strix vanished from the legends of High-Avernus. The Vulture of the Heights became a ghost story told in the new gardens that began to grow where the refineries once stood. The king who traded a spire for the breath of his people. He spent his days in a small coastal village in the west, teaching the locals how to fix their tools and read the mechanical compass of the stars. He had found an authority that didn't require a tower, and a peace that didn't require a mask. He had been born in iron, lived in a lie, and was finally resurrected in the dawn. The spire was gone, the mandate was over, and the world was finally breathing. There was only a man walking into the light.